Hello, and welcome to St. Joseph's College, Catholic Bioethics. My name is Dr. Pressen-Bujno. This is Unit 4, Lesson 8, Genetic Therapy, Testing, and Medical Research. I'm just real quickly going to give you an overview of both, therapy, testing, and research, and, offer a response from the Catholic point of view. I'm going to try to continue my theme of not just simply offering some catechetical response, nor just citing a magisterial document, because what I would call the new evangelization applied to bioethics requires us to engage them in this pluralistic society on that level. Using dogmatic responses only work for the in-crowd. Nonetheless, this will be a solid Catholic critique. So when we talk about genetic therapy, this is using genes to prevent or to treat a disease. In itself, it's praiseworthy, so we should not have a knee-jerk reaction, even if we are very much concerned with how this could go wrong in the future. All good things can be misused, and we have to be part of the steering committee that's going to move this ship in the right direction. So think of the various diseases that are very difficult or incurable. What is it? What would it mean if we could replace these mutated genes or inactivate the ones that cause these issues, or introduce new genes that could perhaps help to alleviate the disorders? Some of those would include the monogenic, so sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Parkinson's, or the degenerative issues of heart disease and cancer and diabetes, and infectious diseases, of one of which I'm just going to name here is HIV. And the reason is because regardless of the intention here, there is always consequences. And this is something that's recognized in the secular world. So I've mentioned previously about CRISPR-Cas9, the genome editing tool. Now, in the United States, if one were to genetically modify an embryo and then establish a pregnancy from that, that would be against the law. Ethically, we could still see here that this has to be done in vitro. So there's issues there that are plain and simple. But still, I think it's important that you know some of the stories that have been going on in the last few years. So in China, He Jiankui disabled the gene CCR5. Now, this was supposed to give the unborn resistance to HIV. So these twins were brought to birth, named at least popularly Lulu and Nana. Now, that even broke law within China, so he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. In the United States, though, in 2016, Kathy Niken, she was the first person to give permission to apply CRISPR to embryos in the U.S. So she edited this gene, POU5FI. Now, this is the gene they suspect responsible for tumorigenesis, so carcinogenous growth within the tumor. So there was 18 embryos that she edited, and 8 of those had abnormalities, and 4 of them actually had deletion of DNA that was adjacent to that particular gene. Now, these embryos were destroyed. They would not be brought. So, again, I don't need to explain the ethical dilemma there. But this, more importantly, brings everybody to caution that there is almost, at this point, an impossibility of going in and simply doing something that just seems to be theoretically possible, but to edit one thing without not affecting others. So there you have, of the 18 embryos that were modified, 8 of those had abnormalities, and 4 simply had the deletion of adjacent DNAs. So this really, the other issue with this is that once these things are edited, they don't stop with the individual upon which genome has been, let's leave it as edited. It enters the germline, which means it's then passed on to subsequent generations. So these things, we can say, have unintentional side effects, and that is not perhaps an argument about the possibilities of where this may go, but it's an extreme caution, and it's one that's simply shared with the secular world. So this is not something that needs to be approached from a dogmatic point of view. Nonetheless, the other thing is that this deals with embryos. So, and they will be destroyed after this is testing that's basically non-therapeutic, which means that overall, when genetic therapy is employed, the goals must remain therapeutic. If they move beyond treatment, Then we're talking about something that borders on eugenics to remove disabilities. Um, what do we do with individuals who are expecting a child with Down syndrome, which nonetheless is a gift, even if that's obviously would be in our modern lingo called a disability. But we all know that people with Down syndrome just act like the rest of us wish we could. They hug you and love you and tell you that and genuinely mean it. So it's more likely they have a saturation of being than any sort of deletion of such, which makes us ask what exactly we're calling normal. Right? And the idea is that if you see deafness as a disability, if you talk with somebody who's deaf and they want deaf children, they're not trying to express the idea of passing on a disability. They understand that to be part of their culture. So we never quite know then, once we start down this road, what the goal is. So we always need to begin with an understanding of the human person and what the goals of the research therapy is. We'll say it that way. So we talk about genetic testing. This is identifying those changes in DNA sequencing. So you're looking at variations of chromosomal structures, levels of protein, and such. So there's always risk involved. Now the reality is that, we own our own health and obviously our family's health. So there are other ways to do this. We have to watch that, and that's not the overall point here, that we don't simply look at medicine and technology in particular as a way to treat those things that otherwise we could do with our own lifestyles. So it's one thing to be on particular medicines that control diabetes and say type 2 diabetes or control even cholesterol, but without pairing those with a lifestyle change, we're simply relying on a pill or technology to do that which was within our power. So we could reduce our own disease risk all to a certain point. Now that's not to disregard anything we're saying here. Many of these things that we cannot, and they are inheritable. Now, when we talk about prenatal screening, what they are looking for is inheritable health, risk, various birth defects, and such. I'm just going to speak of two here. One is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So they would, this would be in, let's say, in the process of in vitro fertilization. So they would try to identify any disorders or the sex of the child. They would look for single gene defects or chromosomal disorders. Now, the reality here is, first of all, is it's hard to describe how this cannot and would not lead to selective termination. So if there are, say, 7 embryos that have been fertilized within, the in vitro fertilization process, the woman is not going to receive them all as implants, so you're going to start selecting which of these embryos, and using like a term healthy or viable. But by that I mean not to have certain attributes. Well, it's very difficult to make the case that because we see these things as defects or disorders by identifying them in the prenatal screening, that we would not look at a human, let's say, an adult human that possesses any of those things as less. We might say that we don't think that, but we're not ethically schizophrenic to the point where if we see this as a disorder in a child, we're going to see this as a disorder in an adult. If we would say, if we had the chance, we would not want this in the child, then we would not want that in the adult. Seems to be a pretty easy conversation to convince somebody of. That does not mean that we would not want to take care of other things like, heart disease and Parkinson's and such. But nonetheless, those aren't the only things being screened out. So other aspects come into this. So another way to use this pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is with pre-implantation tissue typing. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because this would be if you're hoping to have a child who, because they are a tissue match for a present sibling, so you can almost hear these as savior siblings. We need a bone marrow transplant. We need an organ tissue match. We cannot get one, so what if we had another child, and then that child could offer the respite medically for this individual. So these are potential donors for living siblings. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in itself, except that you can understand that this child was brought into the world for the sole purpose of helping an older child. That's got to have some effect on the individual. If they know about it, I mean, it'd be unlikely that it's going to not come to fruition in their knowledge at some point. But the reality is, too, is this is all done in vitro. So it's one thing that a couple has another child, and then hopes from that this child is a match. That's salutary. It's altogether a different situation when a family is going to, perhaps in vitro fertilization, have 6 or 7 embryos, and then do some sort of do pre-implantation tissue typing to find out which one of these is the greatest of the potential to help their living sibling, and then bring that to fruition. You could see this as very utilitarian, to say the least. And this prenatal screening, let me just give you like 2 instances. One would be fetal aneuploidy. So this is when you would have 1 or more extra chromosomes. So women who are giving birth at higher, later in their life, let's say in their 35 plus, that factor, that higher maternal age, is a contributing factor to a situation like that where you might have 1 extra chromosome, or autosomal trisomy, where you could include Down syndrome, but it can also include issues of the sex chromosome. So the XXX, which is often undiagnosed, or XXY, which is labeled Klinefelter syndrome. So this would be a male who has poorly functioning testicles, or perhaps breast enlargements and such. And on the female side, Turner syndrome, where they just have 1 X, typically infertile, shorter in stature, delayed puberty and such. Now, these are variances and abnormalities in the sex chromosome. They don't present distinct sexual, in other words, they don't present a third distinct sex. They're abnormalities on the XXXY chromosome. But nonetheless, these could be determined in prenatal screening also. So I've already spoken a little bit about the fact that whatever we see as defects or abnormalities in the embryonic stage, and I think this is the good argument to make, that it's almost impossible to believe that somebody's not going to see that manifest itself in a discrimination in the adult population. Which brings us to the conclusion: how do we determine the value of the human person? Are we slowly, crawling into some sort of instrumental dualism, which I'll mention shortly what that is. This is the best way to balance the positives of genetic therapy, and as long as provided this could be therapeutic and it's not done in vitro where the embryos will be killed, but nonetheless it's going to discriminate somebody. So there's always a power imbalance, and a value is always going to be used to determine the worth of the individual. So I think if we focused on that argument, it's, how do we say, based within a solid Catholic bioethical approach, but it also offers a really good chance to have a discussion about concerns that exist within the secular world, so that it's not in a sense of simply trying to make the supernatural seem rational, although it is that. It's just trying to say that those things which have been divinely revealed to us are good for us and can be known in the natural sphere. Well, I'll leave it at that. With medical research and experimentation, as you should already have gleaned from just the previous points on this slide, that the technology that's available to the bioethical and medical field is extraordinary, and it's also proportionally growing to the point where laws, civil laws, have a hard time keeping up. But as far as the ethics of it, technology is never just simply neutral. It's always something that's going to be used for a particular end, and there's always an ethical action that needs to be, how do you want to say, evaluated. So we have to watch two types of dualism here. I'm offering instrumental dualism. This would be where we devalue the body and we start to look at the psyche or the spirit. So it's like what's inside matters most, and that determines the body. Physical dualism would be the opposite of this, if you want to call it that, or at least the other side, where we worry about the interior and not so much the body. But we have to watch here with instrumental dualism that we don't simply try to acquiesce to what the intentions are. We're incarnated beings, so this understanding of the human person, body and soul, really frustrates and should frustrate instrumental dualism. So in human subjects, as far as medical research goes, the function of the person, their body and mind, has to always be ensured not to be disrupted. And whatever the goal is in the experimentation and research, it must be for prevention or cure. Somebody might say, well, what else could it be? Well, it has to contribute to the development of understanding and science. So this isn't just to be curious. This isn't just to sort of see what the extremes of the body might be, or anything else that doesn't protect the integrity and dignity of the human person. As far as entering the research, it always has to be entirely free, and so too free to withdraw. Let me just mention something here that maybe put a little flesh on this. So when they start doing the human test studies with COVID-19 vaccinations, you always have a control group that has the placebo. Once you get to stage 3, when you see the effectiveness of these particular vaccinations, now you have a moral dilemma as to what do we do with the group that was in the placebo side of this study. In other words, what if individuals within that group have comorbidities or other high risk factors? Should they be told that they have the placebo? Are you putting them in harm's way? The disadvantage there is that they don't stay in the study, then long-term effects, because this people would argue that COVID-19 vaccinations have not been technically FDA approved, they've been granted emergency authorization. It's because they haven't gone through the studies long enough. We haven't enough time, right? So do these people withdraw? Now that's a little bit of a twist on that, but nonetheless, anybody that's doing the study should always have the freedom to withdraw. This has to do with just medical consent, which we'll look at, I think, in the next lecture. And consent is never fixed or static. It has to continually move throughout the patient's treatment and such. Now, if we go back to talk just about embryos as subjects, if there's a way to do this, and I'm not going to get into how that might actually come to fruition, there could be no harm done. So the integrity of the embryo always has to be maintained. And here, because just like any adolescent or minor, the consent always has to come through the parent. Parental consent must be full. And whatever needs to be done has to be therapeutic. So theoretically, if something, even in the early stages of pregnancy, could be done in utero in order to help a particular disorder or disease that would be after birth, then the church would not be opposed to that, provided that these three things were to remain. No harm was going to come. The parent consented, and whatever was being done was indeed therapeutic. So when we talk about solidarity, now remember, solidarity is not an interdependence. I should say it this way. It is interdependence. It's not simply an interconnectivity. So we mutually rely on each other. And we're made, it's part of our being made in God's image, that we're relational. And relational doesn't just mean that, we just benefit from having these other relations. It's just that we can even not know ourselves as individuals outside of those relations. So this interdependency has to do with individuals and society. So we have to watch asserting a particular interest or aim or goal that an individual may seek and pretend that it has no effect in society at large. But we also have to have solidarity between our present society, understanding that whatever we do here and now is going to have an effect on a future society. So no technology is morally neutral. and whatever technology we're using to affect us here and now will affect us in the future. We could talk about that in terms of DNA sequencing and passing on the germline, but we can also talk about how it just creates a new ethos that gets passed on. In medical professional situations, the reason why medical ethics is such an important field for professionals that intend to serve is that studies have shown that individuals, nurses and physicians and such, that enter into a facility tend to acquiesce to the ethical ethos that's currently present, which means that even though you, a person, could have your own sense of this, you tend to follow the group. And that doesn't mean that it's done blindly, but it's just a natural thing that the ethos of the group affects the ethos of the individual. Well, if we could just somehow, transplant that to a future society is affected by the ethos of the present society, that's my point with that solidarity. We're also in solidarity between the creation and the creator, so that involves us as human beings, but it involves all of creation. If they say that we're all made from the same stardust, both trees, rocks, and human beings, that's not something that denounces the value of the human being. It just simply puts us all in the same category of creation. We're in solidarity with our Creator, and for us, that means imaging our God. And it has to always be founded on this anthropology. What is this human person, and what is our ultimate end? It's impossible to not understand that our ultimate union is with God, and that is the highest good, even above our health, which is the highest physical good. But I would like to think that we would all lay down our lives for those that we love, which means that we do have a senses of the spiritual and transcendental components of us as human beings that we value above that as our own life. So all these things must be kept in solidarity. I hope this was at least a little introduction to therapy testing and research, and thank you for listening.